The Korean Mafia boss gave his credit card to a poor single mother for 24 hours. What she did broke him. A Korean Mafia boss gave a homeless single mother his unlimited credit card and vanished into the Seoul night. 6 hours later, his phone buzzed with a transaction alert. It wasn't what he expected. It wasn't what he feared. It was something far more dangerous, something that would force him to confront a truth that could unravel 20 years of carefully constructed beliefs. Because in that moment, with a single purchase, she didn't just spend his money. She exposed his soul. 39-year-old Seo Seung-hyun had stopped believing in human decency the day he took his first life. As undisputed leader of the Hwarang Syndicate, he controlled shipping routes across 3 continents, private casinos that laundered millions, and weapon pipelines that armed conflicts most people only read about in newspapers. His penthouse overlooked the Han River. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing Seoul's glittering skyline like a kingdom he'd conquered with blood and ruthlessness. He owned safe houses in 5 countries. His watch cost more than most families earned in 5 years. Yet every morning, he woke up with a hollow chest and a conscience he'd buried beneath violence, so calculated it had become art. His late father, So Yong-ho, had hammered one doctrine into him since childhood. The poor will always take everything and still ask for more. They're black holes of need, son. Give them a hand and they'll rip off your entire arm. Desperation doesn't make people noble, it makes them dangerous. Seung-hyun had carried that gospel like sacred text for 20 years. Every act of power protected by layers of fear and distance. Every business decision filtered through suspicion and control. He'd never once looked poverty in the face and simply trusted. Not without leverage, not without insurance, not without keeping his hand on the trigger. But that late October night, something fractured in the armor around his heart. He'd just finished a syndicate meeting in Gangnam, leaving behind a room thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic taste of threats delivered in whispers. His assistant, Jae-won, trailed 3 steps behind, scrolling through encrypted messages on a burner phone. Seung-hyun's custom-tailored suit cost more than a luxury sedan. His leather shoes clicked against pavement with the confidence of someone who'd never feared walking alone at night. His mind churned with shipment schedules, rival gang movements, politicians who needed reminding of their debts. Then he saw her. Sitting near the entrance of a late-night grocery mart was a woman, maybe early 30s, with exhaustion carved so deep into her features it looked permanent. A little girl, no older than 4, slept curled against her chest, wrapped in a coat that had seen too many winters. The woman's arms were locked around the child like a fortress built from nothing but desperate love and sheer will. A cardboard sign rested at her feet. Black marker, unsteady letters. Single mother. Lost my job. Anything helps. Seung-hyun stopped walking. Jae-won nearly collided with him. Boss, the car is waiting. We have the Busan call in exactly 7 minutes. Wait here, Seung-hyun said, his voice strange in his own ears. He approached slowly, expensive shoes silent against concrete, unsure why his body moved when every trained instinct screamed to keep walking. Homeless people lined Seoul's streets like ghosts. This wasn't unusual. This wasn't different. This was just another casualty of a system he'd learned to exploit. Except something about her stopped him cold. When the woman looked up, there was no performance in her eyes. No rehearsed desperation or calculated plea. Just bone-deep exhaustion. The kind that settles into your soul after months of carrying weight that should break a person but somehow doesn't. Her lips were chapped from cold nights. Her clothes were clean but worn threadbare. She'd given up on vanity but refused to surrender dignity. I'm sorry, she said immediately. Voice rough from disuse. We're not blocking the entrance. We can move if we need to. Her apology for existing hit Seung-hyun harder than any bullet ever had. What's your name? He asked, crouching down despite the protests of his designer pants touching filthy pavement. She blinked, surprised that Danger could wear a suit that expensive and still kneel. Amina, she said quietly. Amina. And your daughter? The woman's arms instinctively tightened around the sleeping child. Protective, primal. Her name is Zuri. She just turned 4 last month. Seung-hyun studied Amina's face. Intelligence lived behind that exhaustion. Education in the careful way she chose her words. This wasn't someone born into poverty. This was someone who'd fallen from somewhere higher and was still falling. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. Shame flickered across Amina's features like a candle in a storm. 3 months. We stayed with a friend until she had to relocate. We've been rotating between stairwells and the women's shelter when they have space. Hello, my friends and loved ones. Before we continue this awesome story, thanks for joining me on this beautiful story. As we continue this story, kindly take a moment to subscribe to this channel, like the video, and I love to always hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it at your end right now? Thank you for subscribing. 3 months. A 4-year-old child sleeping on subway floors and in stairwells while thousands of people walked past every single day, their eyes trained carefully ahead. Jaewon cleared his throat impatiently behind him. "Boss, we really must." Seunghyun raised one hand, silencing him without breaking eye contact with Amina. His father's voice echoed in his skull. "The desperate will bleed you dry and vanish before dawn." Maybe it was time to test that theory himself, to prove once and for all whether his father had been right or whether Seunghyun had spent 20 years believing a lie that protected his empire but poisoned what remained of his humanity. Seunghyun reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. Amina's eyes widened slightly, probably expecting a few bills if she was lucky. Maybe 50,000 won. Maybe 100 if the universe felt generous. Instead, Seunghyun pulled out a matte black platinum card. No spending limit, no restrictions. Just pure, unrestricted access to wealth most people couldn't comprehend in their wildest nightmares. Amina stared at it like he'd pulled out a loaded gun. "Take it," Seunghyun said, holding the card between them like a bridge between two different worlds. "I don't understand," Amina stammered, pulling Zuri closer as if the card itself might detonate. "It's yours for 24 hours. Seunghyun explained, his voice steady despite the chaos of doubt screaming inside his head. "Buy whatever you need. No limits, no questions, no conditions." Amina's hands began to tremble. "Sir, this has to be some kind of trap. People don't just hand out credit cards to strangers, especially not to people like me." "I want to see something," Seunghyun said, and for the first time in years he spoke complete truth. "I want to see what someone with nothing does when given everything. I want to test something my father taught me. Prove him right, or prove him wrong." He pressed the card into her palm. Her fingers were ice cold, rough from exposure, shaking like paper in wind. "Why me?" Amina whispered, tears pooling in eyes that had cried themselves empty months ago. Seunghyun looked at Zuri, sleeping peacefully despite the cold, despite the noise, despite the absolute chaos of her entire existence. He thought about his own childhood private tutors and security details and summers in Switzerland. Every need met before he could even articulate it. This child had nothing except a mother who refused to let go. "Because I'm tired of assumptions," Seunghyun said quietly. "Because I want to believe there's still something good left in people who've lost everything. Prove my father right or prove him wrong. Either way, I'll finally know the truth." Amina closed her fingers around the card slowly, like someone touching fire for the first time and expecting third-degree burns. 24 hours, Seunghyun repeated, standing up. His knees protested from kneeling on frozen concrete. "Spend whatever you want. There's no pin, just sign your name. I'll find you here tomorrow morning. Same time, same place." Jaewon looked physically ill. "Boss, this is insane. We should at least establish parameters. Legal protection. Asset safeguards." "No parameters," Seunghyun said firmly, his eyes still locked on Amina. "No protection, just trust." The word felt foreign in his mouth. Trust. He'd spent decades eliminating it like a weakness. Amina opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She just clutched the card like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in open ocean. Her entire body shaking with emotions Seunghyun couldn't begin to name. As he walked away, his father's voice whispered warnings in his head. "She'll drain your account. She'll disappear into the night. You're a fool, Seunghyun. A sentimental, naive fool." But another voice, quieter, more fragile, whispered something different. What if she doesn't? Sung-hyun didn't sleep that night. His penthouse felt cavernous and cold despite the heating system that cost more than most cars. He stood at the window, staring at Seoul's glittering skyline, wondering if somewhere out there, a homeless woman was about to prove everything he'd ever believed was a carefully constructed lie. Amina didn't sleep that night either. She sat in the flickering fluorescent light of the 24-hour convenience store bathroom, Zuri asleep on her lap. The black credit card clutched in her trembling hand like a grenade with the pin half pulled. This had to be a trap. Men like him, men in suits that cost more than her entire previous life, didn't just hand out unlimited credit cards to homeless women sitting outside grocery stores. They didn't kneel on dirty pavement. They didn't look at you like you were human. They especially didn't trust you. Her late husband David's voice whispered through her memory, warm and steady like it had been before the cancer ate him alive. Baby, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. David had been a good man, an accountant with steady hands and a laugh that made everything feel manageable. They'd had a small apartment in Itaewon, modest savings, simple dreams. Then the diagnosis came. Stage 4. 6 months if they were lucky. They weren't lucky. The medical bills swallowed their savings first, then their apartment, then their dignity. David died in a public hospital bed, apologizing with his last breath for leaving them with nothing. That was 2 years ago. Amina had tried. God knows she'd tried. She worked 3 jobs translating documents, cleaning offices at night, tutoring English on weekends. But Seoul was expensive and unforgiving, especially to a black single mother with no family and dwindling connections. When her employer discovered she'd been sleeping in the office storage room with Zuri, they fired her for security concerns. 3 months ago, the last thread snapped. Now here she sat, holding a stranger's credit card, wondering if this was divine intervention or the cruelest joke the universe had left to play. Zuri stirred in her sleep, her small hand instinctively reaching for the worn teddy bear pressed against her chest. She'd named it Daddy Bear the week after David died. The bear's left eye had fallen off months ago, but Zuri refused to let it go. Amina's heart cracked down familiar fault lines. Her daughter deserved better than this. Better than sleeping in bathroom stalls and subway stations. Better than wearing clothes scavenged from donation bins. Better than a mother who apologized for existing. She looked at the card again. 24 hours. No limits. No conditions. What if he was telling the truth? What if this was real? And what if it wasn't? The fear paralyzed her. Fear of being arrested for theft. Fear of some hidden camera recording her for a cruel social experiment. Fear of hoping for something that would be ripped away the moment she reached for it. But greater than all of that was a different fear. What if she did nothing and wasted the only miracle she might ever receive? At 6:14 a.m., Amina made her choice. She carried sleeping Zuri to the convenience store next door, her hands shaking as she picked items off the shelves with surgical precision. Bread, milk, rice balls, fruit, nothing extravagant, nothing that screamed greed. The cashier barely looked up as Amina handed over the black card, certain it would be declined, certain alarms would sound and security would drag her away in handcuffs. The machine beeped. Transaction approved, 28,900. Amina's knees nearly buckled. It was real. The pharmacy came next. Cold medicine Zuri had been coughing for weeks. Children's vitamins. Band-aids for the cuts on her daughter's knees. Diaper rash cream even though Zuri was long past needing it because the shelter always ran out. Transaction approved. 47,300. Then the bakery. Fresh pastries Amina hadn't been able to afford in 2 years. She watched Zuri's eyes go wide when she woke to see the cream-filled bun, the way her daughter whispered, "Is this real, Mama?" With such desperate hope, it shattered something inside Amina's chest. "It's real, baby," Amina whispered back, blinking away tears. "Eat." By mid-morning, Amina had purchased a winter coat for Zuri, shoes that actually fit, socks without holes, underwear, everything practical, everything necessary. Nothing for herself. She couldn't. Every item felt like borrowed time, like stealing from a future that would demand payment she couldn't afford. But then she passed the women's shelter on Dongdaemun, the place where she and Zuri sometimes slept when beds were available. She thought about the mothers there, the newborns crying through the night, the teenagers kicked out by families who couldn't accept them, the women fleeing violence with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Amina stopped walking. She pulled out the card one more time. Women's shelter donation. 150,000. Transaction approved. That night, in a small room at a budget motel she'd rented for 45,000, Amina watched Zuri sleep in an actual bed for the first time in months. Her daughter wore new pajamas and hugged a brand new teddy bear, her breathing finally steady without the rattle of sickness. Amina knelt beside the bed, the black card still in her pocket, and whispered a prayer she'd stopped believing in months ago. Please, she breathed into the darkness. Please let this be real. Please let him have meant it. Please don't let this be the thing that breaks us. Outside, Seoul glittered with lights that had always felt like they belonged to someone else's world. For the first time in 2 years, Amina let herself imagine they might belong to hers too. Seung-hyun stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching Seoul's neon veins pulse through the darkness below, and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt afraid of something he couldn't kill. The Han River stretched black and silent beneath him, reflecting city lights like scattered diamonds on velvet. His penthouse was climate-controlled to exactly 21 degrees Celsius. His bourbon cost 800,000 per bottle. His view was worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Yet he felt like a man waiting for a verdict that would determine whether his entire existence had been built on lies. His phone sat on the marble counter, screen dark and silent. Midnight came and went. Nothing. 1 a.m. Nothing. 2 a.m. Still nothing. Seung-hyun paced the length of his living room, expensive shoes clicking against Italian tile, his father's voice echoing through his skull like a curse that wouldn't break. The poor are predictable, son. Give them access to wealth and they'll take everything. It's not cruelty, it's nature. Desperation makes animals of everyone. So Young-ho had taught him that lesson at 14, forcing young Seung-hyun to watch as a debtor who'd sworn loyalty stole from the syndicate coffers and fled in the night. His father had hunted the man down personally, made Seung-hyun watch the execution, and whispered, "This is what trust gets you. Remember it." Seung-hyun had remembered. For 20 years, he'd remembered. Every act of violence justified by that single truth. People were liars. Especially desperate people. Especially people with nothing to lose. Better to be the wolf than the fool who believed in sheep's clothing. At 3 a.m., doubt crept in like smoke under a door. What if she'd already maxed out the card and disappeared? What if she was halfway to Busan by now, laughing at the idiot mafia boss who'd handed over unlimited wealth to a complete stranger? What if his assistant Jaewon was right, and this was the most expensive mistake he'd ever made? Seung-hyun poured another bourbon he wouldn't drink and stared at his phone like it held evidence of his own stupidity. At 6:14 a.m., the screen finally lit up. Transaction alert. 28,900 GS25 convenience store, Gangnam. Seung-hyun grabbed the phone so fast he nearly dropped it. 28,000 won. Barely $30. Not a hotel, not a shopping spree. Not even a decent meal at a restaurant. He stared at the notification, waiting for the flood that would inevitably follow. The jewelry stores, the electronics, the luxury purchases that would prove his father right and Seung-hyun naive. At 7:02 a.m., another alert. Transaction alert, 47,324-hour pharmacy, Gangnam. 47,001. Medicine? Toiletries? His chest tightened with something that felt uncomfortably close to hope. At 7:31 a.m., the third notification arrived. Transaction alert? 19. 800. Paris Baguette, Gangnam. A bakery. She'd bought bread. Seung-hyun sat down heavily on his leather sofa, the phone trembling slightly in his hand, his entire worldview beginning to crack like ice over deep water. This wasn't the behavior of someone exploiting wealth. This was someone shopping like they expected the card to be declined at any moment. This was someone afraid of being greedy. This was someone buying only what they desperately needed. His father's voice grew quieter. Another part of him, a part he'd buried beneath violence and cynicism, whispered something dangerous. What if you've been wrong about everything? Throughout the morning, more transactions appeared. A children's coat, shoes, basic necessities. The amounts were modest, careful, almost apologetic. And then, at 11:47 a.m., an alert appeared that made Seung-hyun's hands go completely still. Transaction alert, 150,000 Dongdaemun Women's Shelter donation. She'd donated money. A homeless woman with nothing had given 150,000 to a shelter. Seung-hyun stood abruptly, the bourbon glass forgotten on the counter. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened windows, a man who'd built an empire on the belief that mercy was weakness and compassion was a luxury only fools could afford. He'd given her the card to prove his father right, to confirm that desperate people were exactly as selfish and predictable as Seo Young-ho had promised, to justify every cold decision he'd ever made. Instead, she was proving him catastrophically wrong. At 8:47 a.m., the next morning, hours before their agreed meeting time, Seung-hyun left his penthouse and drove back to Gangnam, his heart pounding with something that felt terrifyingly close to shame. He needed to see her face when she returned the card. He needed to understand what kind of person gave away money they didn't have. He needed to know if redemption was still possible for a man who'd spent 20 years believing it didn't exist. Seung-hyun found her exactly where he'd left her. Amina stood near the checkout counter of the same grocery mart, Zuri held against her hip. But everything about them had changed. The little girl wore a clean red winter coat that actually fit. New shoes. Her hair was brushed and tied with a small ribbon. She hugged a brand new teddy bear, bright brown fur, both eyes intact, and was smiling. Actually smiling. Amina saw him approaching, and her entire body went rigid with fear. She immediately shifted Zuri to her other hip and reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the black credit card like she was returning stolen property to its rightful owner. "I was going to bring it back," she said quickly, her words tumbling over themselves. "I swear, I just needed a few things first. I have all the receipts. I kept every single one. I can explain everything." "Stop," Seung-hyun said quietly. She froze, clutching the card between them like a confession. He looked at Zuri, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes. No longer the hollow-faced child sleeping on cold pavement, but something closer to what a 4-year-old should be. The transformation hit him harder than any accusation could. "What did you buy?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Amina hesitated, then reached into her other pocket and pulled out a wrinkled plastic bag stuffed with receipts. Her hands trembled as she held them out. "Everything's here. I wasn't trying to." Seung-hyun took the receipts and began reading. GS25 convenience store. 28,900, bread, milk, rice balls, fruit, juice boxes, 24-hour pharmacy. 47,000. 300 children's cold medicine. Vitamins, Band-Aids, diaper rash cream, Paris baguette. 19,800 pastries, sandwiches, children's clothing store, 156,000 winter coat, age 4, shoes, size 220 millimeters, socks, 6 pairs, underwear, 10 pairs. Every single item was for Zuri. Every single one. Seung-hyun's throat tightened as he continued through the stack. A budget motel room, 45,000 for one night of safety. A small toy store purchase, 23,000 for the teddy bear Zuri, now clutched like a lifeline. Basic necessities purchased with the precision of someone who understood the difference between survival and luxury. Then he reached the last receipt. His hands went completely still. Dongdaemun Women's Shelter donation, 150,000 won. Seung-hyun stared at the paper, reading the words over and over as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense within his understanding of the world. "You donated money," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amina lowered her eyes, shame coloring her features. "There are mothers there with newborns, women fleeing violence. I saw them last week when we stayed there. They have even less than we do. I couldn't. I didn't want to take everything when… You're homeless, Seung-hyun interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. You've been sleeping in stairwells. Your daughter has been sick. You have nothing. I know, Amina whispered. And you gave money away. She nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. I'm sorry. I know it wasn't mine to give. I know I shouldn't have. You didn't buy anything for yourself. It wasn't a question. Seung-hyun flipped through the receipts again, searching desperately for evidence of selfishness, for proof that his father had been right, for anything that would let him maintain the worldview he'd built his entire life upon. Nothing. Not a single item for her. Not clothes. Not food beyond what she'd share with Zuri. Not even basic necessities. My daughter comes first, Amina said simply, as if this was the most obvious truth in the universe. Something inside Seung-hyun's chest cracked open like a dam breaking. 20 years of his father's doctrine disintegrated in the space between one breath and the next. 20 years of believing that desperation made people selfish. 20 years of justifying cruelty because mercy was weakness. 20 years of violence built on a lie he'd never bothered to question. He looked at Zuri, who had set down her teddy bear and was coloring quietly on a piece of scrap paper someone had given her, humming softly to herself. So innocent. So oblivious to the fact that her mother had just destroyed a mafia boss's entire moral foundation with nothing but basic human decency. Seung-hyun had ordered executions over less money than the shelter donation. He'd ended lives for smaller acts of perceived betrayal. He'd built an empire on the assumption that people like Amina didn't exist. And here she stood, returning his credit card with trembling hands, apologizing for giving charity to people more desperate than herself. For the first time in 20 years, Seo Seung-hyun felt ashamed of his wealth, ashamed of his assumptions, ashamed of every cold decision he'd justified with his father's poison. Come with me, he whispered. Amina's eyes widened with fear. To where? Seung-hyun looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what he should have seen from the beginning. Not a test subject or a cautionary tale, but a person who deserved better than the world had given her. Somewhere warm, he said quietly. Somewhere safe. Amina's knees buckled, and Seung-hyun caught her before she fell. Amina pulled away from him like his touch burned. No, she said, her voice sharp with panic. No, I've seen this before. Men with money don't just help. They want something. They always want something. Seung-hyun felt the accusation like a blade between his ribs, accurate and deserved. I don't want anything, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. Men like him always wanted something. That was the nature of power. Then why? Amina demanded, clutching Zuri tighter. The little girl had stopped coloring and was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. Why would you do this? Why would you care what happens to us? Seung-hyun opened his mouth and found he didn't have an answer that made sense. Because you proved my father wrong? Because you made me feel ashamed? Because for the first time in 20 years, I looked at another human being and felt something other than suspicion? All true, none adequate. Because I'm tired, he finally said, the truth scraping raw against his throat. I'm tired of being the man my father made me. I'm tired of waking up in a penthouse that feels like a mausoleum. I'm tired of believing the worst in everyone because it's safer than being disappointed. Amina's eyes narrowed. So this is about you? About making yourself feel better? Maybe, Seung-hyun admitted. I don't know. I don't know what this is. I just know that I gave you that card expecting you to prove every terrible thing I've ever believed about humanity. And instead, you… He gestured helplessly at the receipts still clutched in his hand. You gave money to people worse off than yourself. You bought nothing for yourself. You spent 24 hours with unlimited wealth and stayed exactly who you were. I'm nobody, Amina whispered. You're better than me, Seung-hyun said. And the admission felt like swallowing glass. You're better than me, and you're sleeping in stairwells while I'm drowning in luxury I don't deserve. That's not right. That's not… I can't. His voice broke. Seung-hyun had ordered men tortured. He'd watched rivals beg for mercy he didn't give. He'd built his empire on a foundation of blood and fear and calculated cruelty. He'd done things that would make decent people recoil in horror. And this woman, this homeless single mother who had every reason to be bitter and selfish, had shown him more humanity in 24 hours than he'd shown anyone in 20 years. "I don't trust this," Amina said, but her voice had lost its edge. Now she just sounded exhausted. "I don't trust you. I don't trust that this won't disappear the moment I start to believe it's real." "I know," Seunghyun said. "But please, just for tonight, let me give you and Zuri somewhere safe to sleep. No conditions, no expectations, just safety." Amina looked down at Zuri, who had buried her face against her mother's shoulder, confused and frightened by the tension crackling between the adults. One night, Amina finally whispered, "Just one night. Then we leave." One night, Seunghyun agreed, even though he was already planning much more than that. The hotel suite felt obscene. Seunghyun had chosen the intercontinental Seoul-neutral territory, expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of place that asked no questions about guests who arrived with no luggage and haunted eyes. 2 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a bathroom larger than some apartments, room service available 24 hours. Amina stood frozen in the doorway, Zuri clinging to her leg, both of them staring at the space like it might be a mirage that would dissolve if they stepped inside. "This is too much," Amina breathed. "It's a room," Seunghyun said quietly. "Just a room." But it wasn't. It was warm. It was safe. It had locks on the doors and clean sheets and a minibar stocked with food Zuri could actually eat. It had everything Amina and her daughter had been denied for 3 brutal months. Zuri took one tentative step inside, her new shoes squeaking against polished floor. Then another. Then she turned to her mother with eyes so full of hope it made Seunghyun's chest physically ache. "Mama, can we stay?" Amina's composure finally shattered. She sank to her knees and pulled Zuri into her arms, sobbing into her daughter's hair with the kind of desperate relief that comes from carrying impossible weight for far too long. Seunghyun turned away to give them privacy, staring out at Seoul's glittering skyline, the same view he'd watched from his penthouse just hours ago. But everything looked different now. He'd built an empire believing that mercy was weakness, that compassion was a luxury, that trust was a currency only fools spent freely. A homeless woman had destroyed that belief with nothing but basic human decency. And for the first time in 20 years, Seo Seung-hyun understood the difference between power and worth. Behind him, he heard Zuri whisper, "Mama, is this heaven?" Amina's broken laugh sub was the only answer. Seung-hyun closed his eyes and made a silent promise to a god he'd stopped believing in long ago. "I'll do better. I don't know how, but I'll do better." The receipts were still folded in his jacket pocket. He suspected he'd carry them for the rest of his life. Amina didn't sleep the first night in the hotel. She sat in a chair beside the bed where Zuri actually slept. Not the fitful half-consciousness of someone expecting to be kicked awake at any moment and watched her daughter breathe. Clean pajamas from the hotel gift shop. Sheets that smelled like lavender instead of mildew and desperation. A pillow that wasn't a balled-up jacket. Every few minutes, Amina would reach out and touch Zuri's forehead, half convinced this was a dream that would evaporate when she opened her eyes. At 3 a.m., she finally allowed herself to cry. Not the silent, swallowed tears she'd learned to hide from Zuri, but deep, racking sobs that purged 3 months of terror from her body. She stumbled into the bathroom marble counters, heated floors, a shower with water pressure, and stood under scalding water until her skin turned pink and her tears mixed with steam. When she emerged, wrapped in a bathrobe that cost more than her last week's worth of meals, she found a room service cart outside the door. Fresh fruit, pastries, rice porridge, orange juice, a note in precise handwriting. For breakfast. No rush. S. Amina sat on the floor and ate strawberries while crying. In the morning, Zuri woke up confused, disoriented, then delighted. "Mama, there's a TV, and it works, and there's a button that makes the curtains open." And she stopped mid-sentence, her face suddenly falling. "Is this real?" Or are we pretending? Amina pulled her daughter close. It's real, baby. For how long? The question broke Amina's heart. I don't know. But Seunghyun apparently did. He arrived at 10 a.m. with 3 people Amina didn't recognize. A woman in professional attire carrying a tablet, a younger man with kind eyes and a social worker's badge, and Jae-won, who looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. These are people who can help, Seunghyun said without preamble. Miss Han is a housing advocate. She specializes in finding permanent accommodation for single mothers. Mr. Housen is in Never. Park is a social worker who can navigate government assistance programs. They're here to help you build something sustainable. Amina stared at them like they were speaking a foreign language. I don't understand, she whispered. You need more than a hotel room, Seunghyun said. You need an apartment, a job, childcare for Zuri, healthcare, stability. He gestured to the professionals flanking him. They know how to make that happen. Miss Han stepped forward, her smile warm and genuine. We've already identified 3 potential apartments in safe neighborhoods near good schools. All within your future budget once we secure employment. There's also a healthcare assistant training program starting next month, 12 weeks, fully subsidized, job placement guaranteed. I can't afford, Amina started. Everything is covered, Seunghyun interrupted. Tuition, childcare during training, living expenses until you're employed. Amina's legs gave out. She sat heavily on the edge of the bed, Zuri immediately crawling into her lap. Why are you doing this? She asked for the 2nd time in 2 days. Seunghyun crouched down to her eye level, and for a moment, she saw something raw and broken beneath his controlled exterior. Because I've spent 20 years using power to hurt people, he said quietly. I'd like to try using it to help someone instead. Behind him, Jae-won shifted uncomfortably. Boss, perhaps we should discuss the financial implications. No, Seunghyun said, without turning around. This isn't a discussion. The syndicate can survive without bleeding every penny from people who have nothing. Seunghyun stood, his voice hardening with the authority that had built an empire. I want weekly reports on Amina and Zuri's progress. Housing secured within 2 weeks. Training enrollment finalized within 3. Clear? The professionals nodded immediately. Jae-won looked like he was watching his boss lose his mind in real time, but was too smart to say so aloud. Over the next 3 weeks, Seunghyun became a constant presence in their lives, not intrusive, but steady. He helped Amina navigate paperwork she didn't understand. He sat with Zuri and colored while her mother met with social workers. He made phone calls that opened doors previously locked to a homeless black woman with no connections and no leverage. He used fear when necessary, a quiet word to a discriminatory landlord, a carefully phrased suggestion to an employer dragging their feet on hiring decisions. The same power he'd once wielded to destroy, now repurposed to build. One evening, as they assembled donated furniture in Amina's new apartment, 2 bedrooms, heat that worked, windows that locked, she paused and looked at him. You're not what I expected, she said. Seunghyun tightened a screw on Zuri's bed frame. What did you expect? A monster! He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I am a monster. I'm just trying to be a different kind. Amina handed him another screw. Monsters don't build children's beds. Maybe they should, Seunghyun said quietly. Maybe that's how they stop being monsters. In the other room, Zuri was naming every corner of her new bedroom with the seriousness of a tiny monarch claiming territory. And for the first time in 20 years, Seunghyun felt like he was building something that mattered. The apartment wasn't luxurious. It was a modest 2-bedroom in Mapogu, 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. The walls needed repainting. The kitchen was cramped. The view overlooked a parking lot and a convenience store. To Amina, it looked like paradise. She stood in the empty living room on move-in day, her hand resting on the doorknob, a door that locked from the inside, a door that was hers and couldn't stop the tears streaming down her face. Mama, why are you crying? Zuri asked, tugging on her sleeve. Don't you like it? I love it, baby, Amina whispered. I love it so much. Sunhyun arrived an hour later with a truck full of furniture, nothing extravagant, just functional pieces purchased with care. A sofa, a kitchen table with 4 chairs, beds for both rooms, a small desk where Zuri could draw and color. He'd also brought Jae-won, who looked deeply uncomfortable with the concept of manual labor. "Boss, we have people for this," Jae-won muttered, struggling with a box spring. "Then consider this character building," Sung-hyun replied, effortlessly carrying a bookshelf up 4 flights of stairs. They worked through the afternoon, transforming empty rooms into something resembling a home. Sung-hyun assembled Zuri's bed with the focused precision he usually reserved for syndicate operations, while Amina unpacked donated kitchenware and tried not to feel overwhelmed by the simple miracle of having cabinets to put things in. Zuri appointed herself room naming captain and insisted on christening every space with elaborate titles. "This is the royal kitchen of breakfast magic," she announced solemnly, pointing at the cramped cooking area. "This is the chamber of many dreams," she declared in her bedroom, where Sunghyun had just finished installing curtains with tiny stars printed on them. "This is the fortress of Mama's peace," she whispered reverently about Amina's room, as if understanding instinctively that her mother needed sanctuary. Sunghyun found himself smiling, genuinely smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. A week later, Amina started her healthcare assistant training program. Sunghyun had arranged childcare through a subsidized program near Zuri's new school, a small kindergarten with a playground and teachers who actually seemed to care. He drove them both on the first day, watching Amina's hands tremble as she dropped Zuri off. "What if she cries?" Amina asked anxiously. "Then they'll call you," Sunghyun said. "That's what phones are for. What if the other kids are mean to her? Then she'll learn to stand up for herself. Or she'll make friends. Children are resilient." Amina looked at him with something close to wonder. "You're good at this." "At what?" "Being reassuring." Sunghyun thought about the men he'd reassured before killing them and decided not to share that particular irony. Zuri adapted to school with the easy flexibility of childhood. Within a week, she had 2 best friends and a passionate obsession with learning to write her name in both English and Korean. Amina threw herself into training with the fierce determination of someone who'd been denied purpose for too long. She studied late into the night after Zuri was asleep, her apartment light visible from the street below where Seung-hyun sometimes sat in his car, keeping watch over something he couldn't quite name. He visited weekly, always bringing something small, groceries, children's books, the occasional toy that made Zuri shriek with delight. Never anything too expensive, never anything that felt like charity. Just presents. One evening, 3 weeks after the move, Amina called him into the kitchen while Zuri colored in her bedroom. "I need to give you something," she said quietly. She pulled the black credit card from her purse, the same card he'd given her that night outside the grocery mart, the card that had started everything. "I kept it," she admitted, shame coloring her voice. "I was scared. I thought if I gave it back, everything would disappear. That you'd disappear. That I'd wake up and this would all be gone." Seung-hyun looked at the card, then at her face, stronger now, with better sleep and regular meals, but still carrying the wariness of someone who'd learned that good things were temporary. "Keep it," he said. "I can't." "For emergencies," he interrupted. "For Zuri if she needs something. For you if—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like pity. "For peace of mind." Amina's eyes filled with tears. "You trusted me. You earned it. No one has ever." Her voice broke. "My whole life, no one has ever just trusted me like this. Without wanting something. Without conditions." Seung-hyun thought about his father's voice, now barely a whisper in the back of his mind. About 20 years of believing trust was weakness. About how a homeless woman had destroyed that belief with nothing but basic human decency. "You taught me something," he said quietly. "You taught me that my father was wrong, that I've been wrong, that power is meaningless if you're not using it to build something worth protecting." Amina pressed the card back into his hands, then closed his fingers around it. "Then you keep it," she whispered, "as a reminder of who you're choosing to become." And standing in that cramped kitchen that smelled like rice and hope, Seo Seung-hyun, mafia boss, killer, architect of fear, cried for the second time in his adult life. The first was when his father died. This time felt different. This time felt like being born. 6 months after the night outside the grocery mart, Seo Seung-hyun found himself standing in a cramped kitchen teaching a 4-year-old how to make kimchi fried rice. "No, Zuri, you have to let the rice get crispy first," he said, gently guiding her small hands away from the pan. "Patience is important in cooking." "But I'm hungry now," Zuri protested, bouncing on her toes. "Then you'll be even happier when it's perfect," Seung-hyun replied, and caught Amina watching them from the doorway with an expression he couldn't quite read. This had become his Thursday evening routine. Visit Amina and Zuri, share a meal, help with homework, listen to Zuri's elaborate stories about school, sit in comfortable silence while Amina studied for her certification exams. It was the most mundane, ordinary thing he'd ever done. It was also the only thing that made him feel human. Amina had graduated from her healthcare assistant program 2 months ago and was now working at a community clinic in Songdong-gu. The pay was modest but steady. She'd started saving money, actual savings, not just survival funds. She'd bought herself new shoes last month and cried about it for 20 minutes. Zuri was thriving in ways that broke Seung-hyun's heart and rebuilt it simultaneously. She'd made the honor roll. She'd joined a taekwondo class. She'd stopped flinching when strangers approached. The haunted look had vanished from her eyes, replaced by the bright curiosity that should have been there all along. Last week, she'd insisted Seung-hyun attend her school's family day. He'd sat in a tiny plastic chair meant for children, surrounded by actual families, while Zuri proudly showed him her artwork, a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures labeled Mama, Zuri, and Mr. Seung. Not the scary man, not Mama's friend, just Mr. Seung. Like he belonged there. Like he was family. The drawing was now framed in his penthouse, the only decoration in the entire space that meant anything. "You're different," Jae-won said one afternoon, watching Seung-hyun review spreadsheets with unusual distraction. "How so?" Seung-hyun asked without looking up. "You smile now. You laugh. Last week you let that debtor off with a warning instead of..." Jae-won gestured vaguely. "You know." Seung-hyun did know. 6 months ago, he would have made an example, sent a message, reminded everyone what happened to people who failed to pay the Hwarang syndicate. Instead, he'd restructured the debt and offered the man a legitimate job in one of his legal businesses. "People can change," Seung-hyun said quietly. "Can they?" Jae-won asked. "Or are you just delaying the inevitable?" The question haunted Seung-hyun for days. Because Jae-won was right about one thing, he was different. Fundamentally, irreversibly different. The man who'd given Amina that credit card 6 months ago had believed in his father's doctrine so completely he'd designed the entire exercise as proof of concept. That man was gone. In his place was someone who couldn't sleep at night thinking about all the Aminas he'd walked past, all the desperate people he'd exploited instead of helped, all the violence he'd justified with his father's poison. He started reviewing the syndicate's operations with new eyes. The protection rackets that bled small businesses dry, the loan sharking that trapped desperate families in permanent debt, the weapons trafficking that armed conflicts and orphaned children just like Zuri. Every operation suddenly had faces attached. Mothers, daughters, people trying to survive in a world that crushed the vulnerable. People he'd been crushing for 20 years. One night, sitting in Amina's living room while Zuri slept, and Late Night Soul hummed outside the window, he finally spoke the truth aloud. "I want to dismantle it," he said quietly. Amina looked up from her medical textbook. "Dismantle what?" "Everything. The syndicate, the criminal operations, all of it." She set down her book slowly. "That's dangerous." "I know. People will try to kill you." "I know that too." "Then why?" "Because I can't keep building a future for you and Zuri while destroying futures for everyone else," Seung-hyun said. "Because every time Zuri shows me her schoolwork, I think about the children who won't get to go to school because their parents are trapped in debt to my organization. Because I've spent 6 months learning what it means to help someone, and I can't unlearn it." Amina studied his face for a long moment. You're serious? Yes. This is because of us, because of what happened that night. Seung-hyun thought about the receipt still folded in his desk drawer, about watching transaction notifications and expecting betrayal, about a homeless woman who donated money to people worse off than herself. I gave you that card to prove my father right, he said quietly. To confirm that desperate people are selfish, that trust is weakness, that I was justified in every terrible thing I'd ever done. And instead? Amina prompted. Instead, you proved that I'd spent 20 years believing a lie. Seung-hyun looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something crack open in his chest. You didn't just pass my test, Amina. You rewrote me. In the other room, Zuri murmured something in her sleep, and Seung-hyun made a decision that would either redeem him or destroy him. Probably both. 10 months after the night that changed everything, Seung-hyun sat in a small park near Amina's apartment and watched her teach Zuri how to ride a bicycle. The scene was achingly ordinary. Amina jogging alongside the wobbling bike, one hand steadying the seat, her voice a constant stream of encouragement. You've got it, baby. Keep pedaling. I'm right here. Zuri's face locked in fierce concentration. Her new helmet slightly too large, slipping forward over her eyes every few seconds. The moment Amina let go and Zuri rode 5 glorious meters on her own, both of them screamed with joy so pure it seemed to crack open the autumn sky. Seung-hyun felt something inside his chest that he'd spent 40 years learning to suppress. Uncomplicated happiness for someone else's success. When they collapsed on the bench beside him, breathless and laughing, Zuri immediately launched into a detailed explanation of her achievement that somehow involved dragons and magic and a very confusing subplot about her taekwondo instructor. Amina just smiled, her hand resting on her daughter's back, her face transformed by a contentment that seemed impossible for someone who'd been homeless less than a year ago. She's relentless, Amina said, watching Zuri run off to try again. Like her mother, Seung-hyun replied. Amina turned to look at him, and something in her expression shifted, became more serious, more searching. Can I ask you something? She said quietly. Always. That night, when you gave me the card, what were you really hoping would happen? Seung-hyun had known this question would come eventually. He'd been dreading it and simultaneously rehearsing his answer for months. Honestly? He took a breath. I was hoping you'd prove my father right. That you'd be selfish, greedy. That you'd take everything and disappear. Because if you did, it would justify every terrible thing I'd ever done. Every cold decision. Every act of cruelty. It would prove that I was right to never trust anyone. Amina nodded slowly, her face carefully neutral. And when I didn't? When you didn't, my entire worldview collapsed. Seung-hyun looked at his hands. Hands that had killed. Hands that had built an empire on violence. I thought I was testing you. Measuring your character. Proving a theory about human nature. But, Amina prompted gently, but you were testing me. The words came out rough, scraping against truth he'd spent months trying to articulate. Every choice you made, buying only necessities, donating to the shelter, taking care of Zuri before yourself, it held up a mirror to who I'd become. And I hated what I saw. Zuri's laughter echoed across the park as she successfully navigated a turn. I don't hate you, Amina said quietly. You should. Maybe. She tilted her head, considering. But hate is exhausting. And I've spent enough of my life being exhausted. You helped us when you didn't have to. You've kept helping us. You've become... She paused, searching for the right word. You've become someone different than who you were. Because of you, Seung-hyun said. Because you showed me what I should have known all along, that my father was wrong. That desperation doesn't make people monsters. That poverty doesn't erase dignity. That the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they do with what little they've been given. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. My father taught me that trust is weakness, that compassion is a luxury, that the poor would always take everything and demand more. I believed him for 20 years. I built an empire on that belief. I justified every terrible thing I did because I thought people like you didn't exist. And now? Amina asked. Now I know that wealth without compassion is just expensive emptiness. That power without purpose is violence wearing a suit. That I spent 20 years becoming exactly what I should have been fighting against. Seunghyun watched Zuri ride her bicycle in wobbly circles, her joy uncomplicated and pure, and felt the ghost of his father's voice finally, mercifully, fall silent. I gave you my card to prove my father right, he said quietly, the final truth settling between them like a confession. And you proved my entire life wrong. Amina reached over and took his hand, a simple gesture, but one that meant absolution, acceptance, the possibility of becoming someone new. Good, she said simply. Wrong was making you miserable anyway. Zuri crashed spectacularly into a bush and emerged laughing, covered in leaves, absolutely triumphant. And for the first time in 40 years, Sol Seunghyun understood what his wealth was actually for. Not power, not fear, not proving his father's poisonous doctrine, but this, watching a little girl learn to ride a bicycle, helping a good person rebuild a life that should never have been destroyed, using everything he'd accumulated to make the world slightly less cruel than he'd found it. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. If you enjoyed the story, friends, please kindly subscribe to this channel and leave a thumbs up. See you in the next story. Thank you for subscribing. Bye!